We live on a terrifying planet, but not all life sees it that way. Because for every extreme environment that exists, there's an extremophile that thrives within it. Today, I'm gonna explain every type of extremophile to you, from least extreme to most extreme, but we need to start by defining extremophile. An extremophile is an organism that lives optimally under extreme conditions. What makes conditions extreme? Well, it's kind of subjective. There's no official rule, but it usually just describes an environment that the vast majority of life would die horrible deaths within. Additionally, to be an extremophile, it's not enough to survive, but to thrive in the extreme. If an organism can survive an extreme condition but can't grow or reproduce in it, it would be considered extremotolerant, not extremophilic. Okay, that's all you need to know. Let's start off hot with thermophiles, organisms that thrive in high temperatures, anywhere from 41 degrees all the way to 122 degrees Celsius. This is the Grand Prismatic Spring, the largest hot spring in the United States. It has this unique rainbow coloration, hence its name, created by thermophilic microbes living around the edges of the hot water. These colors are created by pigments called carotenoids, which are red, orange, or yellow, and by chlorophyll, the same stuff that gives plants their green color. The blue in the center of the spring is just the color of the water, because the center is actually so hot that it's completely sterile, so none of the local microbes can survive in there. When our body temperatures go even a single degree or two above baseline, our proteins begin to denature within us. Suffice it to say, most cells are very temperature sensitive and are unable to survive high temperatures, especially not to the level of hot springs, deep sea hydrothermal vents, and fumaroles. So for thermophiles to live, they need to have thermostable enzymes, proteins, and DNA that don't get completely destroyed by boiling temperatures. And while plenty of them have adapted these traits, others have found their own solutions. Sulphophiles is a genus of thermophilic archaea that has their DNA constantly damaged due to the high temperatures of their environment. To deal with this, they aggregate with each other and exchange genetic material to repair damaged DNA through homologous recombination, a process you may be familiar with if you've taken a genetics course. This DNA exchange solves the denaturation issue without needing to develop extreme heat resistance, because instead of trying to prevent DNA destruction, Sulphophiles just constantly regenerates its DNA with the help of neighboring cells. There's evidence that these thermophilic bacteria are among the earliest bacteria ever, so some think that their ability to exchange DNA may be a primitive trait that would go on to evolve into sexual behavior in another lineage. On the other side of the pillow, we have Psychrophiles, which thrive in cold temperatures all the way down to -20 degrees Celsius. Life is mostly made of water, and since water freezes at 0 degrees, negative temperatures don't exactly make the most sense to survive in. Now, mammals have solved this by being warm-blooded and regulating our internal temperature to still be warm even in the cold. But this is a temporary fix. We can't stay in the cold permanently like Psychrophiles have to, at least not without ways to heat ourselves up in the process. In 1897, the Belgian Antarctic expedition was launched, the first ever expedition to spend a winter in Antarctica. Here, they discovered the largest purely terrestrial animal native to the continent, the Antarctic midge, a flightless fly that was able to survive year-round in Antarctica, even being able to withstand being frozen. They do this by having tons of hydrogen bonds to stabilize proteins and keep membranes from stiffening too much, as well as heat shock and anti-freeze proteins to help with tolerating extreme temperatures. There are actually several insects that do well in the freezing cold. Some of them live in the cold permanently, but others only do it for the winter season, preparing themselves in a process called cold hardening. This is the same thing that many plants do before winter. Here in Canada, the trees shed their leaves every fall, relocating their nutrient stores from their leaves into underground storage organs so that they can better survive the prolonged period of cold. But this hardly compares to psychrophilic bacteria that can enter the viable but non-culturable state, or VBNC. This state allows bacteria to be completely frozen in ice, unable to do anything, yet survive for what seems like forever. Some bacteria cells have survived over 500 500,000 years in the permafrosts of Antarctica, Canada, and Siberia, and have even been revived upon leaving the ice. It's because of this that a lot of people are afraid of an ancient superbug, a deadly pathogen from millions of years ago, frozen away under layers of ice that we've had no time to develop resistances for. As the planet's temperature continues to rise and the ice continues to melt, maybe it'll come back alive and infect us, and then we're screwed. This probably won't happen, but it's definitely not impossible, so I see why people are worried. Hopefully we'll be fine. Hopefully. Acidophiles are able to thrive in very acidic environments, usually pH 5 or lower, but the most acidophilic organism, microbes in the genus Psychrophiles, are able to grow at pH levels of negative 0.06. The reason acid irritates our skin or burns entirely through is because they're proton donors. This means that they provide hydrogen ions to a lot of molecular compounds, which can completely restructure it and ruin its intended functioning. Proteins, sugars, cell walls, and DNA can all be irreversibly damaged from exposure to strong acids. So most acidophiles use proton pumps to rapidly push out hydrogen ions from their cytoplasm and maintain a neutral pH. But there are exceptions to this. The bacteria Acinetobacter aceti has an acidified cytoplasm, meaning that all the proteins in its genome have evolved acid stability. As a side effect to this, A. aceti can react with ethanol and produce acetic acid, the primary component of vinegar, so it's actually used for a lot of industrial productions. Acidophiles may turn out to be more useful than previously thought, especially because human pollution is causing a lot of environments to have higher pH levels. Maybe we'll need to genetically engineer the perfect acidophile in order to neutralize this. The opposite of an acidophile is an alkalophile, where optimal growth occurs in basic conditions pH 9 or above. Soda lakes are bodies of water that have high alkalinity, usually between pH 9 and 12 due to their high concentrations of sodium bicarbonate. Despite these seemingly inhospitable circumstances, soda lakes are actually the most productive aquatic environments on Earth. They have a rich diversity of microbes doing a lot of photosynthesis, up to 16 times the global average of freshwater lakes. This leads to large algal blooms, creating all sorts of colorations on the lake's surface. Bases do the opposite of acids in that they're proton acceptors, which can still mess up everything in your body at the molecular level just by taking a different path to get there. It's no coincidence that lye, a base used to make soap, is also used for disposing corpses, as it can break down every part of the human body all the way down to the bone. Among extremophiles, many organisms qualify for more than one extremophilic category. This makes sense, because naturally extreme conditions tend to be extreme in more ways than one. The deep ocean is extremely cold, has really high pressure, and low nutritional availability. Hydrothermal vents have high temperatures, high pressures, and high acidities. So to live in these places, you need to be a polyextremophile. We know of many polyextremophiles, but most research has focused on resistances to individual extremes. So the considerations of how multiple extremes affect an organism and its ecology and evolution is barely understood. But I figured this would be the perfect place to introduce everyone's favorite, the main character of Extremophiles, the tardigrade. Tardigrades, or water bears, are famous for being able to withstand pretty much anything. Extreme temperatures, pressure, radiation, starvation, and even the vacuum of space. In 2021, a tardigrade was cooled to 10 millikelvin, just barely above absolute zero, and after 420 hours, it came back to life. Believe it or not, tardigrades being extremophiles is actually a misconception. They do require a more moderate environment to reproduce, so they're actually extremotolerants, not extremophiles. Though of course, most people don't know that distinction, so they refer to them as extremophiles anyways, which is fine. But I think it's most accurate to call them hyper-polyextremotolerants, and I will get back to them in a second. Moving on, we have Piezophiles, which optimally grow in environments with high hydrostatic pressures, up to 10 megapascals. All Piezophiles are polyextremophiles because high pressures tend to be found in places that are really hot or really cold. An example of a thermophilic Piezophile is the Archaea pyrococcus, which can be found in deep-sea hydrothermal vents. And an example of a psychrophilic Piezophile is Colwellia marinimania, which was discovered from the body of a decaying amphipod at at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. In case you don't know, the Mariana Trench is the deepest oceanic trench on Earth. For reference, the theoretical limit of a diver is 1,000 meters deep and 100 atmospheres of pressure. Any more would completely crush your body. The bottom of the Mariana Trench, Challenger Valley, is 10,816 meters deep and exhibits a pressure of 1,071 atmospheres. There's a reason why deep sea equipment needs to be carefully constructed to survive the pressures of deep waters. We wouldn't want to end up on a submersible looking for the Titanic, which was poorly made to withstand deep sea pressures, causing everybody aboard to die, would we? But that just goes to show how insane sea marinomania is. As the most piezophilic organism in the world, it has an optimal growth pressure of 1,200 atmospheres, even more than that of Challenger Valley. Capnophiles thrive in high concentrations of carbon dioxide. We breathe in oxygen, then breathe out CO2. Plants and other things take in CO2 for photosynthesis, creating energy and oxygen. But too much CO2, even for the organisms that consume it, is still going to be toxic. There's a capnophile that infects our mouths called Agregatibacter actinomycetemcomitans. I'm just gonna call it Greg. Greg causes periodontitis, or gum disease, which I probably contracted from trying to pronounce its full government name. Because we constantly emit CO2 from our mouths, Greg has adapted to become a capnophile and withstand the CO2. Capnophiles aren't extensively studied, so I don't really have too much more to say about them. They aren't really used for any practical reasons besides, Mannheimia succiniproducens, which has attracted some interest in the production of succinic acid, which is used in food, beauty products, and medicine. But yeah, that's really the extent of capnophiles. I guess you could use their names in the world's hardest spelling bee as well. You know, I get a lot of comments along the lines of, I don't really learn anything in school, but I do when I watch your videos. It turns out, learning is more engaging when you enjoy it and you seek it out yourself. And that's exactly what you can do with Brilliant, who is kindly sponsoring today's video. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in data science, math, programming, and AI. Whether you're learning a new skill or brushing up on old ones, Brilliant provides an easy-to-use platform that is designed to be the most effective way to learn. Their interactive lessons, made by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers, and professionals, focus on core principles to help you build understanding from the ground up. And their approach to hands-on problem solving is proven to be 6 times more effective than watching lecture videos. I'm actually currently using Brilliant to learn how to code. I'm learning the essential coding elements, I'm using Python to create my first program, and I'm just overall learning to think more like a developer. It's always been a dream of mine to make a game or an app of some sort, and Brilliant is helping me achieve that, all by spending a couple minutes on my phone every morning. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for 30 days free and get 20% off an annual premium subscription, visit brilliant.org/daninblue. You can also scan the QR code on screen or visit the link in the description. Thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Sulphophiles. High sulfur, dangerous. They adapt to it. I feel like you guys get the pattern. Deep in the Frasassi caves of Italy, if you touch your hand to the wall or ceiling, you may find it completely covered in boogers. Because much like stalactites, the rocks that hang from walls and ceilings, snotite is a sulphophile that hangs in the same way. Snotite, also called snoticles, are actually mats of bacteria, which when grouped together have the consistency of nasal mucus, hence the name. These bacteria synthesize energy from volcanic sulfuric compounds, and create sulfuric acid, also known as battery acid, as a byproduct. This is why some scientists believe that snotite may play a larger role in shaping caves than previously thought. In sulfur-rich environments, the sulfuric acid they produce may have chipped away at rocks for millions of years, contributing to vast cave formations. Okay, next up we have Extremotrophs, which actually aren't Extremophiles, but I feel like they fit the vibe, so I'm including them anyway. Extremotrophs are organisms that can consume material that's generally considered non-consumable. Plastics, metals, compound discs, circuits, radioactive waste, and other other long-term pollutants are all examples of this. Typically, organic material decomposes because of things eating them. Fungi, mold, maggots, vultures, and more. But since nothing eats the inorganic stuff, like plastic, which we produce a lot of these days, we have oceans and landfills full of them. In 2010, a strain of fungi, Piezophiles microspora, was isolated from stems of plants in the Ecuadorian rainforest. It was discovered to be able to break down polyurethane, a type of plastic. And since it's been actively studied in the lab so that we may create a solution to clean up plastic on a large scale. Perhaps Extremotrophs are the key to reversing the damage we've done to our planet by eating their way through our problems. Speaking of eating, salt and sugar, while tasty in our dishes, can be very deadly in high amounts. If you stepped in a pool with extreme salt concentrations, you would shrivel up and dehydrate as water flushes out of you via osmosis. If you step in a very sugary pool, the high osmotic pressure would cause the same thing to happen to you. The water in your cells would flush right out. But this isn't a problem for Halophiles, which love high salt environments, and Osmophiles, which love high sugar environments. The North Ronaldsay sheep from Orkney, Scotland, has no access to fresh water at all. Instead, they drink salt water and eat seaweed as their only source of food. The amount of salt intake these guys have would kill any other species of sheep, meaning they've adapted impressive resistances to survive with this high salt diet. Other halophiles tend to be microorganisms that live in bodies of salty water, like the Great Salt Lake, the Dead Sea, or the subsurface oceans of Europa. Europa is one of the few places in our solar system that we know has liquid water buried beneath its icy surface, so it's had a lot of notoriety throughout the years, hoping that we might find life there. NASA actually recently launched the Europa Clipper so that we might get a closer look at the moon. And it's really cool stuff. It's gonna use Mars's gravity to essentially slingshot its way there, and it will hopefully reach Europa by 2030, revolve around it 50 times, and send back information that it finds. It's likely that Europa's waters have a high salinity, so if we did find life there, they would most likely be halophiles. But while water is one of our best indicators for potential life, some life on Earth just doesn't seem to care for it. Xerophiles thrive in extremely dry conditions with little to no water activity at all. The cactus is probably the most notable example of this. They survive in deserts with very little rainfall, storing up water and using it very, very sparingly. There are a lot of xerophilic plants called xerophytes. Here is my xerophyte, which is dead because I overwatered it. I was told to water this infrequently, so I took that as like once a week. My logic was that in Stardew Valley, you water the plants every day, so I was like, a week's probably a long time for a plant, right? No, apparently I'm stupid and it should have been more like once a month. But at least we can learn from this that xerophiles are not just able to survive on low water, but they often need low amounts of water, or else you get this. And we can also learn that just because someone has a biology degree doesn't mean that they can provide basic care to probably the easiest plant to take care of all time. But hey, I got this other xerophyte now that I'm watering once a month, and I think it looks healthier. Maybe? It was commonly thought that if you removed moisture from foods, you could prevent it from spoiling, because most bacteria and fungi that cause food to spoil need water to live. And while this does help preserve food substantially, because xerophiles exist, it doesn't work indefinitely. Xerophilic bacteria can enter a state called anhydrobiosis, where they have very little metabolic activity to offset how little water they're taking in, similar to the VBNC state that psychrophilic bacteria can enter. In case you haven't noticed by now, bacteria is very good at surviving. Turns out staying single-celled was the way to go. The next extreme environment we need to talk about is an especially harsh place. Actually, it's less of an environment and more of a platform. It's called YouTube, and Extremophiles called creators rely on organisms called viewers to help sustain themselves. Creators are often required to ask viewers to like and leave a comment and subscribe in order to survive the extreme hazard known as the algorithm. So it would really help me out if you did any of these things. Let's get back to it. Okay, we've reached the extreme extremes now, starting with Oligotrophs, which can sustain themselves in nutritionally limited environments. Everything needs a source of energy, whether that's prey to catch, grass to graze on, or sunlight to bathe in. But Oligotrophs need as little as possible. They live in barren environments like oceanic sediments, caves, ice, deep soils, and aquifers. This is the Olm, a fully aquatic oligotrophic salamander that lives in underwater caves. They were first seen after being washed up in 1689 by heavy rains, and the locals believed them to be baby cave dragons. I mean, what else would you think in 1689? Look at these things. They're fully blind and navigate themselves using chemoreception, sound waves, and an electroreceptor organ in their heads that we're still trying to figure out. Honestly, these guys are really cool. I could do a whole video about them, but the bottom line is they can survive long-term starvation, reducing activity and metabolism in times of need, and even reabsorbing their own tissues in severe situations. In a controlled experiment, scientists found that olms can survive up to 10 years without any food. Pretty crazy for a non-bacteria, I must say. In the case of bacteria though, 4 kilometers beneath the world lays Lake Vostok, the largest subglacial lake in Antarctica, fully encased in ice, isolated from the rest of the world. The lake is large enough to have several separate microenvironments with different microorganisms like fungi and lots of different bacteria. With pretty much zero access to food, these oligotrophs may be perfect for simulating extraterrestrial life. Again, a great parallel for life that might be on Europa. It's actually so crazy that life lives here that some scientists think it's a mistake. They argue that any microorganisms found in Lake Vostok were actually brought in by human researchers accidentally contaminating the lake. It's sort of a mini conspiracy that I still think is unresolved. I personally want to believe that life did reside there before we got there, but I don't know. Metallotolerants are able to survive in high levels of dissolved heavy metals. Metal, of the heavy variety especially, tends to not mesh very well with life, unless you're watching this 100 years in the future and robots are legally classified as alive and they have overthrown us and all that. But for now, there are only a few organisms that can survive and even take advantage of dissolved metals in their environment. The alpine pennycress is a plant that can grow in soils with high concentrations of zinc and cadmium. It takes up metals in its roots and stores them in its leaves to protect from insects, as the metal makes the leaves toxic to chew on. The alpine pennycress is often mentioned in talks of phytoremediation, the process of using plants to clean the air, soil, and waters from harmful contaminants. So it may be a key tool in cleaning up heavy metal pollution around the planet. There are also several metallotolerant microorganisms like ferroplasmas and ensiferes, but otherwise it's a pretty uncommon trait. There really isn't a reason to adapt resistance to metals, since heavy metals being so predominant in an environment that it induces a selective pressure is just not that frequent. And finally, we have radioresistants, which can withstand high levels of ionizing radiation like UV, gamma rays, and X-rays. If there weren't many reasons for an organism on Earth to develop a metallotolerance, there isn't a single reason to become radioresistant. The majority of radiation in our solar system comes from solar winds, which Earth's magnetic field keeps us very safe from, meaning the only ionizing radiation that an organism would encounter is regular sunlight, which I guess can cause cancer over long-term exposure, but is also the reason that life is here in the first place, and man-made sources like microwaves, X-rays, and nuclear waste. These sources of electromagnetic radiation did not exist until we got here, which is very recent in the grand scheme of things, so organisms really should not have evolved any level of radio resistance. And yet, after the Chernobyl disaster, researchers found that a surprising number of plants and animals did fairly well for themselves despite the high radiation levels. Here are the lethal doses of radiation for different organisms. Of course, microorganisms are extremely good at this, particularly Deinococcus radiodurans and Thermococcus gammatolerans, which both significantly outclass even tardigrades here. One possible explanation for this is that radioresistance developed as a side effect effect of thermotolerance. The type of cellular damage caused by high temperatures is very similar to that caused by high radiation levels. So Radioresistants, which is a hyperthermophile, may be radioresistant simply as a consequence of this. That, or it could just be coincidental. The way that these organisms are may just happen to not be affected by ionizing radiation. Just because a trait exists doesn't mean it's always a specific adaptation towards something. Evolution is a messy process, and a lot of things arise by chance, accident, or as an unintended package deal with other adaptations. This may be why the plants and animals near Chernobyl did better than we thought. Perhaps life on Earth isn't extremely resilient because it needs to be, but simply because it is. But what if we go past Earth, to the extreme conditions of other planets, or even the cold, dead vacuum of space? With no oxygen, no magnetic field, and no gravity, can our native life survive? The answer is yes. Sort of. We're working on it. There's no proper term for organisms that can survive outer space, so I'm gonna call them astrotolerants. To be astrotolerant, you need to be polyextremotolerant, because you need radioresistance, psychrotolerance, oligotrophy, and more. Much more. Meaning our best bet, as always, are microorganisms. Our friends the tardigrades are the obvious example here. They are the first known animal to ever survive exposure to outer space. They were taken to low Earth orbit for 10 days, exposed to the hard vacuum of space and solar radiation, and when they were brought back to Earth, most of them survived and some were even able to produce viable offspring. Since then, plenty of other organisms have been tested in low Earth orbit, simulated conditions, or even directly in space, including bacteria, archaea, fungi, lichens, viruses, and more. One of the most notable to me is Coccidiopsis, a genus of bacteria that's thought to be able to live on Mars. Coccidiopsis can photosynthesize in far-red light, so it's actually a prime candidate not just for surviving Mars, but for terraforming it. Clearly, expanding life into the stars is going to heavily rely on studying extremophiles, as will cleaning up the pollution on Earth. And who knows what else? Maybe one day we can genetically engineer humans to survive extreme conditions too. I mean, polyextremophile engineering is already something that's being explored, so why not go extreme with the implications of all this? It's all really cool stuff, so I hope you guys found some value from this video, and consider watching another one if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.